Hello and welcome back to the Wandering Cantos. Today, I thought that it would be fun to do a totally random exercise and compare the quintuplets from the Quintessential Quintuplets to English Romantic poets. And yes, this is probably going to be my weirdest video. So, my criteria. I am primarily focusing on the personalities of the quintuplets, their overall story arcs, and the themes and careers of the Romantic poets. Therefore, I want to give a spoiler warning for the Quintessential Quintuplets since I will be discussing the ending of the series, so if you don't want spoilers, I would avoid this one. Beyond that, I feel like this is the sort of video that doesn't really need much of a preface, so without any further ado, let's begin. Alright, we're going to start with Ichika. So Ichika I would compare to Samuel Taylor Coleridge. So Samuel Taylor Coleridge was an English Romantic poet who worked closely with William Wordsworth. His most famous works include The Rime of the Ancient Mariner, which is a part of the Lyrical Ballads, Kubla Khan, and the Biographia Literaria. The 1798 collection of poetry, Lyrical Ballads, was a collaborative effort between William Wordsworth and Samuel Taylor Coleridge, and it is often credited as being one of the foundational texts in the English Romantic movement. So Coleridge was an adventurous dreamer who certainly had a theatrical side, which you can see in many of his narrative poems. I would argue that Samuel Taylor Coleridge is similar to Ichika not only for being a dreamer, but also for, unfortunately, often being sort of sidelined by his companions. Just as Ichika often has to sacrifice her happiness and well-being for the sake of her sisters, Samuel Taylor Coleridge was often ignored and uncredited when it came to praise for his collaborative work, especially with Lyrical Ballads. He also, unfortunately, had a pretty bad falling out with his closest friend, William Wordsworth, which feels similar to the fallout between Ichika and Miku during the whole Ichika villain arc. And then, some recommended reading. I would recommend, if you're looking for a poem by Coleridge that's sort of Ichika coded, to check out Dejection and Ode. This one is all about romantic feelings for someone you aren't with, and also sort of like a total creative crisis. That being said, a lot of the romantic stuff was kind of cut from the poem, so just be aware of that. Next, we have Nino, and I would compare Nino to Lord Byron. So, Lord Byron was famously described as being mad, bad, and dangerous to know, and if that doesn't also describe Nino, I don't know what will. So, Lord Byron wrote a lot of romance poems that would probably be described today as being very like goth or emo. These poems were all about standing on cliff sides and brooding about failed relationships, unrequited love, and self-loathing. Some of his most famous works include Childe Harold's Pilgrimage, Don Juan, and She Walks in Beauty. I feel like Nino would also be pretty into Lord Byron since we know that she likes dangerous bad boys like Quintero, which again is just Boudreaux. Lord Byron was also popular at parties and was sort of one of the first like rock star-esque celebrities, and there was actually a whole thing called Byron Mania, which is later than kind of why they called Beatlemania Beatlemania. And Nino seems to be one of the most sort of social of the quintuplets, along with Ichika, so in that way I think she has a lot in common with Byron. Lord Byron was also a scathing critic at times and would frequently insult people in his writing, which fits with Nino's more fiery side. And as for recommended readings, if you want a sort of Lord Byron poem that feels like Nino, I would check out When We Two Parted. I feel like this poem sort of fits Nino's reaction to the ending of the Quintessential Quintuplets. If you know, you know. Next, we have Miku. So, Miku I would compare to John Keats. So, John Keats, as a poet, was largely overlooked during his life. He never sort of received the fame and attention of someone like Lord Byron, and yet he still worked passionately on his writing. He was deeply introspective, a dreamer, and fell madly in love with someone he could not be with. Some of his most famous works include his many odes, such as Ode to a Nightingale, Ode on a Grecian Urn, Ode on Indolence, and there's a couple others. He's also famous for his longer works, such as The Eve of St. Agnes and Hyperion. John Keats was also passionate about history and wrote a lot about ancient Greece and medieval romances. Considering Miku's passion for Japanese history and old romances, I think they'd get along. As I mentioned earlier, John Keats was largely ignored in his career, which fits with Miku often being too shy to draw attention to herself. He also fell in love with Fanny Braun, but couldn't be with her due to his lack of wealth. As a result, I think he would be able to empathize with Miku's situation and the vice versa. John Keats also liked good food and good wine and wrote a lot about food, which aligns with Miku's interest in cooking. So, some recommended reading. I would recommend The Eve of St. Agnes, Isabella and the Pot of Basil, and La Belle Dame sans Merci. These are all old medieval romances, and I think Miku would appreciate the medieval imagery and their tragedies. Then we have Yotsuba, and I would compare Yotsuba to William Blake. So, William Blake was a very eccentric poet who wrote Songs of Innocence and Songs of Experience 5 years before lyrical ballads came out. And if you remember, lyrical ballads is one of the most famous pieces of English romantic writing. This means that he was basically locked into Romanticism 5 years before William Wordsworth and Samuel Taylor Coleridge, which is an interesting parallel when you consider that Yotsuba met Futuro 5 years before everyone else. Some of William Blake's most famous writings include The Tiger, Jerusalem, and The Chimney Sweeper. He wrote a lot about childhood, pastoralism, and the industrial city. A lot of William Blake's writings feel sort of less academic when compared to the writings of, say, John Milton or like William Wordsworth, which sort of fits with Yotsuba's aversion to school. He also wrote a lot about community and the innocence of childhood, which sort of fits with Yotsuba's selflessness and affection for children, sort of what we see with her relationship with Futuro's younger sister, Raya. William Blake was also kind of weird and spacey, and he thought in a very interesting, non-conventional way, and I feel like Yotsuba would sort of appreciate a conversation with him. So, recommended reading. I would check out The Echoing Green, Infant Joy, and Introduction. And that's the introduction to the Songs of Innocence. These are happy, upbeat, pastoral poems, and they aren't quite as eloquent as some of the other poems we're looking at, but they have their charm. And then finally, we have Itsuki, and I would compare her to William Wordsworth. So, William Wordsworth is one of the most influential of the Romantic poets. Some of his most important works include lyrical ballads, The Prelude, I Wandered Lonely as a Cloud, and lines composed a few miles above Tintern Abbey. William Wordsworth sort of had a mixed personality. He was noted for being stern and sort of aloof, but also was very warm to those he was close with, which feels similar to Itsuki's relationship with Futuro. William Wordsworth had a rough childhood, and when he was old enough to escape it, he moved to the countryside with his sister. He had a very close relationship with all of his siblings, and that sort of reminds me of Itsuki's love for her sisters. Itsuki Nakano is also both studious and super anti-schoolwork, which is actually very closely aligned with William Wordsworth's values. Wordsworth believed that there was a value in studying, but only to a degree, and he also felt that there was more to be learned out in nature. For example, he went to the University of Oxford, but he didn't really like it, and he much preferred his time out in the Lake District. That being said, however, his writing was still very philosophical and scholarly. So, some recommended reading. I would check out Expostulation and Reply, The Tables Turned, and To My Sister. All of these poems are sort of about taking a break from studying and going out and enjoying life, but they also all mention sort of the value of work, but also the value of indolence. So yeah, that's going to wrap up today's video. So thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please consider giving it a like and let me know if you want to see more of these sort of weird comparison videos. And yeah, also if you want to support the channel, please consider subscribing. But with that being said, I'm going to wrap this one up. So take care and I will see you in the next one.